Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the French Revolution Part 2 by Oversimplified. So last time we saw the early stages of the revolution, and we ended with the king and queen being dragged back to Paris by a hungry mob. Today we'll see how the revolution plays out over a longer time period. Now, if you'd like to see reactions like this early and other exclusive reactions, you can do that by becoming a channel member. You can become a channel member by hitting the join button next to the subscribe button. You'll get access especially to these oversimplified videos early. Now with all that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. Part 2.
King Louis and his family were now in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, where for the next couple of years, he watched as the revolutionary government began to strip away his power. And fearing for his safety, he had to stay on their good side. Hey, look who it is. It's my favorite revolutionaries. Yep, I'm your #1 fan. What can I do for you? Hey, King Louis, so we've made a few decisions. First, all of your friends in the nobility are gonna have to pay taxes the same as everyone else. Great idea. I love it. And as a...
Yeah, so in this early stage of the revolution, Louis and Marie Antoinette, they've been dragged back to Paris, right? And he finds a lot of his power stripped away. Now, not all of them, because though the revolutionaries are slowly radicalizing, we're still talking about essentially supporters of constitutional monarchy, right? So Louis is losing some of his powers, not all, and he sort of goes along with it, right? He wears the Liberty cap, he wears the revolutionary cockade, which was this tricolor ribbon, right? He embraces these symbols of the revolution, pretends that he's a great revolutionary patriot. But you don't have to be a great genius to understand Louis was not super happy about this. Now, he was a sort of vacillating figure, right? He could be swayed by whoever he talked to, but, of course, Louis was a conservative monarch. He was a believer in his own authority, so he was not a fan of all of this. He was frankly under duress, you know? It didn't feel like he had many options, and so for now, he would sort of play along with the revolutionaries.
Side note, the tax money can no longer pay for all your lavish parties. Great, I hate those parties. They're so awkward. And also, we're taking away your Porsche. Oh, come on! I mean...
Hey?
Yay. The king continually found demand after demand being made of him to prove his support for the revolution. On one occasion, a mob would invade the palace and demand he wear the revolutionary bonnet.
Yep.
This is the face of a man who is definitely pretending he wants to wear that bonnet.
Yeah, like I was saying, he was sort of pressured to embrace these symbols of the revolution. The cockade, which you saw there, the Liberty cap, right, all these different things, even though he was not a true supporter of the revolution, nor was his wife or many of his family members. Right, Marie Antoinette was actually quite a bit more conservative than Louis was. Of the two, she was sort of the more strong-willed one, right? She was very conservative. She, essentially from the beginning, wanted to get out of there, resist, and crush the revolutionaries. But of course, Louis, you know, he was more vacillating. It takes him a little while to get there.
Here, I want to mention that one thing King Louis had a problem with was people constantly raiding his palace. But one thing he didn't have a problem with was raiding noobs on this video's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. Raid Shadow Legends is a brand new collection RPG game with amazing 3D graphics.
I'll let the ad play through, though this is an older video, just out of respect for the creator. You know, I mean, I've got nothing to do with any of his sponsors, but out of respect for the original creator, I usually let the advertisements run through, right? So, there you go.
Join my clan. Go to the video description. Click.
By the way, I am a little sick today, so if you see any cuts, that's probably me blowing my nose or coughing. I won't subject you to that.
Good luck, and I'll see you there. Now, where was I? Oh yeah. Seeing the situation rapidly turning against him, the king decided it might be a good idea to leave France and mount a campaign to retake his country from abroad. Luckily for him, he was married to an Austrian.
Right, I was gonna say, he thought it was a good idea. There was a lot of urging from his wife, who was an Austrian, right? She wants to get out of France, you know, ally with Austria, you know, go to her family, and they can team up and take back the monarchy in France, right? And Louis is starting to think, you know what? I've been humiliated enough. Let's do that.
So on the night of June 20th, 1791, the king and his family disguised themselves as servants and attempted to flee to the Austrian Netherlands. The royal carriage made a stop in the town of Varennes, and the postmaster there was like, "Hey guys, what's up? Where are you off to?" We are but a collection of inconspicuous servants heading for the border for no particular reason at all. Say, you, the fat one, you look kind of familiar. Aren't you the king? Nope. Let me see your passport. It says here you're King Louis the 16th. Nope, not me. Take him away, boys.
Yeah, so this whole event is called the Flight to Varennes. That's because it was stopped at Varennes, right? So they're recognized by a local postmaster who, canonically looks at the currency he has and he goes, wait a minute, that's the king right there. Now, to be fair, the king and his entourage made a lot of mistakes. They did disguise themselves, but they were not being too inconspicuous. They were talking with people, chatting, they were giving away gifts as they were going, right? It was pretty clear that this was the king and his wife. And so, this postmaster recognizes them, he's loyal to the revolutionary government, and he turns them in.
The king was promptly returned to Paris, but now the jig was up. His lack of support for the revolution was clear to all, and many considered him a straight-up traitor who tried to abandon his people.
Yeah, and was even more obvious than that. Now, the king fled, tried to escape revolutionary France, so that's sort of already evidence enough. But the king couldn't even pretend, oh, it was my ministers whisking me away, or my family, or whatever, because when Louis fled, he left a note for everybody, stating his exact opinion on the revolution. So I'm going to pull that up now, and we can take a look at that note. So this is the note the king leaves after he flees Paris. I'll leave the link to this and any other documents I use down below. I'm not going to read out the whole thing, but I'll point out a couple of passages for you. So we can start off here. The king is sort of talking about the events that have occurred recently. And this is in third person, by the way, sort of typical monarch stuff. He's speaking of himself here, of the king. All his anxiety, his efforts, all his generosity, all his devotion to his people, all have been disparaged, all have been misconstrued. Right? So Louis is very upset. He feels, well, I was doing a pretty good job, and y'all have tossed me aside. Right? So he's not in a good mood, you could say. Now here he's talking about the interplay between the National Assembly, its authority, and himself. He's basically saying, they allowed me a certain amount of authority, right? The making of the laws should be done in concert with the king. However, he says, in defiance of that clause, the assembly put the king entirely outside the Constitution and refusing to him the right to grant or to withhold his sanction to the articles which it regarded as constitutional. Right, so here he's outlining his grievances with the current government. He's basically saying that his authority has been stripped away from him. Now, he goes through more of his grievances with the current governance and his position, but here in particular, he points out the sort of political factionalism of France at that moment. The spirit of the clubs dominates and invades everything. Thousands of calumniating and incendiary newspapers and pamphlets, which increase daily, are only their echoes and prepare men to become what they wish them to be. So here he talks about the political clubs or factions that are popping up in revolutionary France at this moment. Of course, the most famous of those is the Jacobin Club. That was sort of shorthand, but we know them as the Jacobins, right? So we had a lot of these political clubs representing political factions. Jacobin's the most famous, and he is obviously complaining about their influence, which he sees as incendiary on politics, people, newspapers. I mean, there was a whole rush of political debate, newspapers. Obviously, most of that was not necessarily friendly to Louis. In fact, he feels the sort of spirit of these clubs is to destroy the remainder of the monarchy and establish a metaphysical and philosophical government impossible to put into operation. Now, at this point, full republicanism was still pretty niche, growing but niche, and so really what Louis is talking about here are even the more moderate revolutionaries, just those who wanted to reduce his power, right? He sees them as ultimately wanting to completely abolish the monarchy and establish a government which he says is impossible to put into operation. Now, as the revolution continues, and partially as a result of this action by Louis, republicanism, full republicanism, is going to grow more and more popular. And Louis says, in light of all of this, is it astonishing that the king has sought to recover his liberty and to put himself and his family in safety? He's basically saying, can you blame me? Come on, look at the situation I'm in. Now at the end here, Louis reaches out to his people. Right, he spent the entirety of this letter sort of complaining about the government and these political clubs and all those involved. Here he reaches out to his subjects. Of course, he has this idea, partially true, partially delusion, that, well, the people of France don't agree with this revolution. They love me. Now, there's some truth to that. There are some conservative peasants throughout France that do still love the king. There are those that are completely opposed to the revolution. But there are a lot of people, especially at this point, still early in the revolution, who are on board, right? But in reaching out to his people, Louis says, return to your king. He will always be your father, your best friend. What pleasure will he not take in forgetting all his personal injuries? Right? So Louis saying, come back to me. I'm your father, the father of the country. I'll forget this ever happened. I'm not going to hold it against you, right? So why don't we go back to monarchy? Come on, why don't we go back to the way it was before? Now we know that that very much is not going to happen. But this is the letter that Louis leaves. We can see here signed by himself as he flees to Varennes. Of course, his idea is that he's going to, regroup with some of his royalist allies, the Austrians, and he can strike against the revolutionaries. He'll come back triumphant. That's not what happens, right? He comes back in chains. And leaving this letter, well, that just reveals to everybody that Louis has been pretending this whole time. He was not actually a great revolutionary patriot. And that makes people very angry. So let's get back to the video and we'll see some of that.
As a result, the new constitution of 1791 completely reduced his powers to that of a simple figurehead, a constitutional monarch. However, radicals, such as those in the Jacobin Club, were outraged that the king wasn't to be removed entirely. So a month later, these radicals staged a protest on the Champ de Mars, calling for the king's removal. The government of Paris feared an insurrection.
Yeah, so we have the Jacobin Club here. Like I said, the most prominent of those political organizations. Now, at this point, the Jacobins are sort of on the rise. They're not as dominant as they will be, but they're going upwards, right? I think we saw in the Jacobin Club there Robespierre sort of leading the charge. And here, leading the Champ de Mars protest, we have Desmoulins and Danton. That's, I believe, Danton right there. These are two very important characters in the history of the revolution, right? So a lot of your Jacobins, I mean, there's disagreements among the group, but a lot of them are saying, hey, we should remove Louis immediately. He's a traitor to the revolution. We're going to let him flee, try to join up with his Austrian allies and kill us, and then, what, keep him in the government? That's unacceptable. We need to remove him. And of course, at this point, it is still pretty niche, but you even have some who are saying, remove him and then remove his head.
was mounting, and they sent the military to disperse the crowd. The confrontation escalated and resulted in the Revolutionary National Guard firing on a crowd of revolutionaries.
Yeah.
It was a massacre. The incident exposed a deep division within the Brotherhood of the Revolution. On one side, the moderates who wanted to keep the king as a figurehead. On the other, radicals who wanted to see the king deposed and heads roll. In the wake of the massacre, these radicals received a wave of support. And speaking of rolling heads, one form of equality the revolution introduced was equality in execution.
I will say, on the sort of political changes, right, we start to see the Overton window shift, right, to the point where, at one point, the Jacobins, and we're still sort of in that point, they are the far left of the political spectrum. But as things shift, it ends up that, well, almost everyone in government is some type of Jacobin, right? And so this sort of political center gets more and more radical, and you begin to see a split emerge between the Montagnards, led by Robespierre, and the Girondins, led by Brissot, right? The Montagnards are sort of the radical faction of the radicals, whereas the Girondins are, I guess, the more moderate faction of the radicals. So I'm sure we'll see that split develop as we go. But sort of keep an eye on some of your political organizations and your Overton window as the revolution continues.
Speaking of rolling heads, one form of equality the revolution introduced was equality in execution. This meant no more torturous drawing and quartering, no more inhumane hanging. They wanted all criminals, regardless of economic status, to receive the same penalty, a quick and painless one. Luckily, a man by the name of Dr. Joseph Guillotine had an idea. A heavy blade that falls like thunder. The head flies off, blood spurts, and the man is no more. The guillotine, otherwise known as the National Razor. The guillotine made its debut in 1791 as the new form of execution. The writings of Marat and others continued to call for the execution of anyone suspected of working against the revolution. For him, this included some members of the clergy and nobility who had...
Yeah, so the guillotine was initially seen as this egalitarian execution device, right? The idea was, instead of having different ways of executing a commoner and a high-up aristocrat, we're going to have the same way to take out everybody, and it's going to be a fairly humane style of execution. Right? That's how they viewed the guillotine. I know the guillotine has a very morbid reputation now, is seen sort of as very bloody, but that's in big part because of the violence it's associated with here. It is designed as a sort of egalitarian and, like I said, fairly humane style of execution, as far as execution can be humane, I'll put it that way.
previously benefited from the cruel system of inequality that existed before the revolution. In many parts of the countryside, local lords had found themselves become a target. Sire, the peasants, they're revolting. Oh, come on, that's a bit harsh. Sure, they smell a bit, but I wouldn't say they're revolting. Oh, yes, I see what you mean. Increasingly, these French aristocrats began fleeing France to find solitude in other parts of Europe. And once again, fear began to take hold. The privileged classes of these foreign nations didn't like what they were seeing because they feared revolutionary ideas may spread to their own lands. The National Assembly...
Yeah, these other countries are seeing a lot of French emigres, right? United Kingdom, countries of Europe, the United States get some emigres, and they're bringing tales of revolutionary justice and violence, and that is really freaking out some of your powerful people, politicians, monarchs throughout Europe who are saying, now, wait a minute, and beyond. They're saying, wait a minute, we don't want this violence to spread beyond France. We don't want it to come to our countries.
Actually, now the Legislative Assembly feared that these nations may decide to attack. Then why don't we attack them first? No, you idiots, we are definitely not ready for war yet. Did somebody say something? France declared war on Austria in April 1792 and immediately got pummeled. It also didn't help that Austria's ally, Prussia, joined in the fighting. The Prussian Duke of Brunswick posted a letter.
I will say, I'm sure we'll see the war play out more, but revolutionary France's performance was actually quite a bit better than people expected, right? The army, the military, had sort of been ravaged by a lot of emigration, right? France had lost a lot of its officer corps, but through the mobilization of its people, a lot of whom were very enthusiastic due to patriotism, France actually finds some fairly impressive early success in the French Revolutionary Wars here. It is sort of a mixed bag, right? They're still facing some strong enemies, and a lot of enemies, but they do better than you might expect.
Helped that Austria's ally, Prussia, joined in the fighting. The Prussian Duke of Brunswick posted a letter warning the revolutionaries that if anything happened to the king, he would burn Paris to the ground.
Right.
The Duke's letter proved to be a massive success in inspiring the people of Paris to do the exact opposite of what he intended.
Yeah, so he sends this very notorious letter a couple of the crowned heads of Europe do, where they're like, if you touch a hair on the king's head, we're going to demolish your city. And can you believe that among the revolutionary Parisians, the Parisians, it did not make them say, well, I guess we shouldn't do that. It makes them furious. Of course, they rise up in the streets.
They were enraged by the threat, and on the 10th of August 1792, the tension in the city exploded, and a mob stormed the king's palace. Fighting broke out between the revolutionaries and the king's Swiss guard, with casualties in the hundreds. King Louis fled and took refuge in the chamber of the Legislative Assembly, where Robespierre and his radical Jacobins were gaining ever more power.
So the king's in a lot of trouble now. He has to head to the assembly to take refuge, right? That's how angry the people are at him. And of course, he's not really finding great allies among the revolutionary government officials, as Oversimplified points out. As the Jacobins continue to gain more and more power, Robespierre in particular, though his ascendancy is still a little bit off.
Given the developing situation, the chamber decided to hold a vote, and in what some considered to be a second revolution, it was decided to suspend the monarchy entirely.
Yeah.
King Louis XVI was now just plain old Louis, and he was sent to a prison cell where an eye could be kept on him. A month later, the newly established National Convention officially declared the French Republic, and society underwent a massive change. Enlightened ideas of democracy and equality were being implemented, but
look, it's the same revolution, but it's a massive revolutionary moment, right? You've gone from this essentially constitutional monarchy, right? That's what first happens after we have the revolution, to a full-on republic. That is a big deal, right? I mean, the American Revolution had occurred only a couple years prior, and the establishment of a republic in that case, right, it was a big deal around the world. So we have the same thing here in France. This is a big moment.
very quickly, these ideas seemed to become secondary to fear, paranoia, and a thirst for blood. The new republic began working to violently remove any semblance of the old royalist regime. The church became a prime target. Priests who refused to take an oath to the revolution were deported or arrested. A new state-sponsored atheistic religion named the Cult of Reason was created as a replacement for the Catholic Church.
And so, like a lot of revolutionary movements, the French revolutionaries here try to essentially erase their ties to the past, wipe out all elements of the ancien regime, the old regime. You know, culturally, socially, politically, religion is a big one, right? Catholicism was the state religion of France. There is a big relationship between the Catholic Church and the French monarchy, right? The French government. And so that's one of the main things the revolutionaries sort of want to do away with, right? Now, a big one is seizing a lot of land from the Catholic Church. I mentioned this last time. The Catholic Church was a massive landowner in France, and they made a lot of money from that land. The revolutionaries want to take that land and redistribute it among the people of France, right? So that leads to a lot of people, especially a lot of your sort of middle-class bourgeois individuals gaining a lot of new land. A lot of land taken from the nobility as well, right? These are major social and cultural changes. You have a de-emphasis on Catholicism generally. Priests are forced to, as they said, swear an oath to the revolution. Those that don't, they either get out of there or they're arrested, right? So that's another big change. The Cult of Reason is sort of posited as a secular replacement for the Catholic Church. Later on, we might see it in this video, we have the cult of the Supreme Being, right? So we have a lot of interesting sort of civic religions, you could call them, to try and replace the Catholic Church. You see a lot of changes, and this is probably one of, especially at the time, the most controversial aspects of the French Revolution. I think this is where a lot of the opposition comes from, is the anti-Catholic stuff, right? A lot of opposition among the French peasantry is because they're, you know, staunch Catholics, and they are scandalized. They are infuriated that the revolutionary movement is doing all this, right? Stripping power away from the church. And throughout Europe, a lot of Catholics are extremely upset by the actions of the French Revolution. So like I said, I think the violence and sort of the anti-religiosity of the French revolutionaries are probably the two most controversial aspects.
Church, Notre Dame, along with many other churches, had their religious treasures destroyed and were converted to temples of reason. Even the Christian calendar didn't survive, as a brand new revolutionary calendar was soon introduced. Hey honey, I'm home.
Yeah, this is sort of in line with, you know, some of this like Enlightenment style of thinking, where, you know, sort of the whole idea, it emerges from the scientific revolution, moves into the Enlightenment, is that, you know, we observe the world around us and we can begin to understand through experimentation, observation, how does the world work? You know, first it's sort of scientifically, then it's politically. And then you ask yourself, all right, well, how do we make things work best? Right? So this is this idea among some of these Enlightenment individuals that everything should work very efficiently and we should be using meritocracy. And if something is inefficient, we should replace it. Right? So even if that's something as fundamental as time or the calendar, well, we should make it more logical, more reasonable, right? We had the Cult of Reason. They're very focused around rationality and reason, at least how they see it. And they want everything to be working very rationally. Now, the problem with that is that this is entirely unfamiliar to everybody, and no one really wants to embrace a lot of these ideas. They seem very strange, but that's sort of where some of these reforms come from. It's from this very Enlightenment idea of rationality and efficiency, essentially.
Yeah, whatever, jerk. Whoa, what's wrong with you? You forgot. Forgot what? Everything. This entire year. My birthday was on the 3rd of Germinal, our anniversary was the 12th of Thermidor, and you promised that in Frymare, we'd go on a romantic weekend trip to Venice. No, I said we'd do that in December. December hasn't been a thing for years. The government of Paris, now under the control of the radical sans-culottes, began rounding up suspected enemies.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily under control of the sans-culottes, right? These are sort of your lower class revolutionary types throughout France. Well, I wouldn't necessarily say it was under control of the sans-culottes, right? So these are your sort of working class revolutionary types throughout France, but especially in Paris. It's more like they were lending a lot of their support to the government, and there's a sort of strange relationship, I guess, where they could really threaten the government, but, some of the members of the government, if working intelligently, could also sort of mobilize them as foot soldiers to do their bidding, right? So it's not entirely under the control of these guys, but they do have a lot of influence, and there's a lot of mob violence that certainly influences French politics at this point.
of the revolution and sending them to prison in the thousands. Naturally, a large number of those arrested were members of the clergy and aristocracy. As France's foreign enemies continued to close in, panic spread. Georges Danton made impassioned calls for men to defend the Republic, and tens of thousands of troops left Paris for the front lines. However, in their absence, Paris was left to its own devices.
And it is in this sort of era that someone like a Georges Danton is really becoming very popular. I said he's a very important figure in this whole revolution. We saw him in the Champ de Mars protest, which became a massacre. Of course, as France has become a republic, you need someone like him to really mobilize support, and he's getting very popular, essentially.
Enemy troops arrived in Verdun. The people of Paris feared that their crowded prisons were becoming a breeding ground for counter-revolutionary conspiracy. What would happen if the Prussians reached Paris and freed the aristocrats? Marat believed he knew what would happen. The aristocrats would enact their vengeance on the people. Fearing those they had already imprisoned, mobs descended on Paris's prisons. They broke in, and during the brutal September massacres, aristocrats, priests, and others were tried and executed on the spot. Even women and children weren't spared. With over 1,600 victims, word of the massacre spread across Europe. One British newspaper wondered, are these the rights of man? Is this the liberty of human nature? But there
So here we see some of the sort of violent excesses of the French Revolution, and people who may have been fans of the revolution in 1789, as this is referencing, right? The rights of man, started asking themselves, is this really the revolution that began in 1789? Does this violence represent the rights of man, liberty, these ideals that the revolution was supposed to be about? This is where, well, it's already started happening, but as the king is sort of arrested and France becomes a republic and you see this violence, and of course, especially when Louis is executed, this is when you start to see a lot of your liberal types, your more moderate, but even some of your, I don't know if radical is the right word, but your more staunch liberals start leaving the revolution behind. They say, this isn't really what I was in it for. All right, maybe I supported a constitutional monarchy, and now we've gone full Republican. Right? Maybe I wanted the king removed, but I didn't want him killed. Maybe I support the ideals of the revolution, but I don't support all this violence, this indiscriminate violence. So you start losing a lot of your supporters as the revolution continues, both within France, but also internationally, right? When the French Revolution occurs, I mean, even in the beginning, there is horror from a lot of people, but at the beginning, there is a lot of celebration and support from liberals around the world who say this is a great, revolutionary moment. The overthrowing of this corrupt, tyrannical monarchy, this absolute government. Right? People celebrate this. But you're losing a lot of those people now as we get deeper into the revolution.
There was still one man in particular that Robespierre and his radicals really wanted to see executed. Austria and Prussia pledged that after they defeated France, they'd return King Louis to the throne. Well, checkmate Austria and Prussia, because you can't return a man to the throne if he's already dead. Citizen Louis Capet was put on trial for treason. Obviously, he was found guilty, but his punishment was less certain. Many moderates wanted to simply deport him, but Robespierre insisted the revolution could only live if the king was dead. A vote was held, and by just one vote, Louis was sentenced to the guillotine. If you don't mind.
And I will point out, that vote, someone who voted in favor of the king's death was Philippe Égalité, the patriarch of the Orleans family, a sort of branch of the royal family, right, off of the Bourbons. He voted for the death of his own cousin. That was something that the Bourbons never really forgave the Orleans for. Philippe Égalité was known as quite a liberal. Of course, he'd find himself also executed in the course of the French Revolution. But yeah, that was sort of a big moment. See, they were pretty enthusiastic about removing the king, stripping him of his title, arresting him, but killing him came down to a very close vote. It was a controversial decision.
I'd like to say a few words first. Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. Wait, you're too loud. They can't hear me. Hang on, I haven't finished yet. Wait, dude. Uncool. In her prison cell, Marie Antoinette heard the guns fire, signaling her husband's death. Before long, she would meet the same fate. Back on the war front, France defied all expectations and actually managed to push the enemy back.
Yeah, this is where I say that France actually had some unexpected success in these early months of the war. A mixed bag. They faced some challenges, especially right at the beginning, but people are sort of surprised. And there is this one battle, the Battle of Valmy against the Prussians, where essentially the two armies come up against each other. This is our first major French victory. And the Prussians see among the French army so much vigor and patriotic enthusiasm. They're so excited. They're singing La Marseillaise. They're cheering that they decide to pull back and retreat. Right? Maybe they thought the French had a position that was too defensible, but people often suggest that part of it is that they were intimidated by the sort of revolutionary spirit of the French army, right? Because France here is doing something pretty unique. It's building a sort of army of its own citizenry, right? Now, if you look at armies at this point, it was often men who were, in some way dragged into service, whether they were tricked by recruiters, or these were often seen, armies, as the dregs of society, not super respectable. But the French army here is developing this sort of citizen soldier army based around nationalism and patriotism and the revolution. They're sort of going for a different model. Or maybe you could say an older model, like that of the old Roman Republic in its earlier days.
But then more countries joined the coalition against France, and it all went to pot again. What do? Conscript the masses. The National Convention introduced a conscription law, with each regional department having to meet a certain quota of men for the army. However, not everyone was happy with this new law. You see, while Paris was definitely a hotbed for radical revolutionary fervor, some of the regions outside of Paris weren't quite so keen on the revolution.
So this is the levée en masse. So this is part of France's military success, right? Mass conscription brings a lot of people into the French army. Like I said, part of their sort of unexpected success. Also part of that feeling of nationalism and patriotism. Once again, sort of a new model for militaries, not just France's, but a lot of other militaries would pick up on the French model going forward. However, it's also a pretty controversial decision, right? You can imagine, say, and this might be what they're about to show, a French peasant who may have been sympathetic to the revolution initially, maybe they didn't care, maybe they didn't like it from the beginning, whatever. But as it's gone on, they don't like that the revolution has been so anti-Catholic. They don't like that the king was removed from power. They really don't like that the king has been executed. That horrifies them. And now they're being called up to fight on behalf of this revolution. So the levée en masse, it is part of France's military success, but it causes a lot of discontent and a lot of counter-revolution throughout France.
Were largely still conservative, still supported the church, and just didn't suffer from that much inequality before the revolution. So as the revolution turned increasingly violent and anti-Christian, many were outraged.
Right.
Now, they were being conscripted to fight for the new republic they hated. That was the last straw. Counter-revolutionary uprisings erupted in a number of regions across France. Some would last for years, such as in the northwest, where a large-scale uprising was led by the Owls. Why were they called the Owls? Because their leader was named Jean Owl. Why was he called Jean Owl? Possibly because he could do a really good impression of an owl. Really? That's what we're going with? Owls? Just because this guy can do an impression of one? Hit him with it, Jean. Hoot, hoot. Yeah, okay, that's pretty good.
Wow.
The Chouannerie uprising lasted all the way until 1800. In the summer of 1793, the southern city of Toulon invited the British Navy over for some tea and crumpets. And then they asked if they'd possibly like to stay and occupy the city. Being an important naval base, this was a heavy blow to the Republic, who sent a relatively unknown young captain by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte to help stage the siege of the city. Toulon was recaptured by France in the winter.
Yeah, so we start to see the emergence of one Napoleon Bonaparte, still very early in his career. You know, he's sort of gone from a bit of a Corsican nationalist to now a supporter of the French Revolution. He really, impresses those around him in the case of Toulon, and he will continue to do that throughout his career.
And for his service, Napoleon was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. The most infamous counter-revolution, however, occurred in the Vendée region. Throughout 1793, revolutionary forces clashed with the region's Catholic and Royal Army. The Republic defeated the counter-revolution through cruel pacification. In particular, General Jean-Baptiste Carrier committed brutal atrocities. In one instance, he had thousands of civilians, priests, women, and children tied to ships, which were then sunk.
Yeah, sort of seen as, I suppose, an effective way of killing a lot of people using not a lot of resources, right? So this is where we see some of the worst violence of the revolution in the Vendée. And here we can, I think, start to talk a little bit about the terror, right? So it's this era of 1793, France is involved in war with a lot of its neighbors. It's surrounded, essentially. It is, and it also feels that way. And now you have counter-revolution within the country itself. Now, these counter-revolutions don't actually amount to much, right? The revolutionaries, they defeat them in the end, in part through this massive sort of violence. But you can imagine those in the government, your French revolutionaries, those who have still stuck to the revolution, they feel like they are seriously under threat. And their response is essentially to resort to more and more extreme forms of violence, right? Mass executions, the violence in the Vendée, the arrest and execution of people who were only suspected of opposing the revolution, right? So it's in this era of panic and the revolutionaries feeling that they're really under threat, both from outside the country and within, that leads to that revolutionary terror, of course, with sort of Robespierre heading it up.
Carrier would later be found guilty of war crimes and executed. Back in Paris, the government was still dominated by moderates. With the war going badly, revolts in the provinces,
well, that is quickly changing,
and the economy getting worse, it seemed the government just wasn't doing a very good job. Radicals fear for the safety.
And plus, when we say moderates, now we're talking about sort of 1793, into 94, a little bit after this, but 93 essentially. Now what we're talking about is our moderates are those Girondins I talked about earlier, who were still pretty radical, but they had become the moderates, largely led by Brissot. Some other members would have been someone like a Condorcet, right, a sort of famous intellectual philosopher. And you've got your Montagnard, the Mountain, right, led by Robespierre, right? They're on the rise, the radical end of the radical faction. So that's what we're talking about here. And Robespierre, well, he's going up and up and up. He's gaining more and more power, and the Girondins are sort of experiencing their fall.
The of the revolution intensified, and Marat even began calling for the moderates in the government to be executed. In return, the moderates called for the arrest of Marat. This led to a chain of events with the two sides in heated conflict. Robespierre declared the Jacobins to be an insurrection and called on the people to arm themselves. It all ended on the 31st of May 1793, with the National Convention surrounded by radical sans-culottes and 29 moderate Girondin politicians arrested.
Yeah.
From this moment on, the moderates ceased to be a political force. Robespierre and his radical...
And so a lot of those guys were either executed, or some, like Condorcet, for example, took their own lives, either while imprisoned or before they could be executed, right? So this is sort of the end of that faction.
From this moment on, the moderates ceased to be a political force. Robespierre and his radicals would be in almost total control of the government. And this brings us to the story of...
All right, so before we move on from old Robespierre here, so we're in 1793, heading into 1794. Robespierre and the Montagnard have essentially taken power. The terror is entering full swing, right? It's sort of the height of that revolutionary violence. You know, how exactly does Robespierre justify the terror that's being enacted on France, right? You know, obviously he does these mass atrocities, and I think by the end of his time in power, he was going a little crazy, but he didn't do it for no reason, right? So how does he explain himself? We've got a very useful document from this time that will explain some of this, so let's go to that. So this document right here, on the principles of political morality, was a speech given by Robespierre, and then later a text made in early February 1794. Right, so right in the middle of the reign of terror, at the height of the revolutionary violence of the era, right in the period we're talking about in the video. And in this, Robespierre shares his justifications for the terror, for the violence that is being enacted on his behalf. So I won't, once again, cover everything, and this is linked down below, but I'll point out a couple of passages here. So we start out with Robespierre saying, "Sometime since we laid before you the principles of our exterior political system, we now come to develop the principles of political morality, which are to govern the interior." Right? So this is Robespierre's, sort of treatise on these principles of political morality that are to govern the interior, our country, right? And keep note of this phrase, political morality. We'll see a lot of talk of morality and virtue throughout this piece. So Robespierre sort of denounces the previous form of government, and here he states, "Every precaution must early be used to place the interests of freedom in the hands of truth, which is eternal, rather than in those of men who change, so that if the government forgets the interests of the people, or falls into the hands of men corrupted, according to the natural course of things, the light of acknowledged principles should unmask their treasons, and that every new faction may read its death in the very thought of a crime." So we see a common theme from Robespierre here is that he sees men, a lot of men, as corrupted. Right? They will turn to corruption and away from Republican principles. And so he wants to create this sort of republic of virtue, in his words, that cannot be turned away from that correct path as he sees it. The thing about Robespierre that you may not know is that his nickname early in his career was the Incorruptible. He was known as someone who wouldn't take bribes, who was, very, very loyal to his principles, right? Someone who believed in everything he said and would fight for the things that he believed. Now, maybe that's why he goes through all this violence, because he's not willing to abandon his vision. Robespierre is essentially an ideologue. Right? He's not someone who does this violence for no reason. Now, that's not necessarily a good reason, but he's got a set of principles. He's got an ideology, right? This is why he does what he does. Now, like I said, I think by the end, he starts to sort of lose it. He starts to go mentally a little bit, but here he's laying out why he feels the need for this violence, why the incorruptible man must resort to such acts. He says here, "What is the end of our revolution? The tranquil enjoyment of liberty and equality, the reign of that eternal justice, the laws of which are graven, not on marble or stone, but in the hearts of men, even in the heart of the slave who has forgotten them, and in that of the tyrant who disowns them." Right? So, what's our end goal? The tranquil enjoyment of liberty and equality. Doesn't that sound nice? That's what we're doing this for, right? His vision for society is one in which the citizen submits to the authority of the magistrate obeys that of the people, and the people are governed by a love of justice. Now note that last point. It's not just, the citizen submits to the law, to the legislature, and the legislature submits to the people. But that third step, where the people are governed by a love of justice, that's necessary to Robespierre's vision. The people need to hold his political principles and his political virtues close to heart, or that's not his vision, right? So we're seeing he's got a particular vision of this republic he wants to create, where it can be a sort of democratic republic if it aligns with how he sees things, right? Like I said, he's an ideologue. He talks about his sort of ideal republic versus that of a corrupted monarchy, all these different values, in a word, all the virtues and miracles of a republic instead of all the vices and absurdities of a monarchy. And here he talks a little bit about France and sort of France's destiny, that France, once illustrious among enslaved nations, may, by eclipsing the glory of all free countries that ever existed, become a model to nations, a terror to oppressors, a consolation to the oppressed, an ornament of the universe, and that, by sealing the work with our blood, we may at least witness the dawn of the bright day of universal happiness. Right? So Robespierre, his goals here, he feels he has to achieve them through blood, right? In order to get where he wants to go, it's going to take a lot of violence. And the reason that he needs things to perfectly align with his vision is because weaknesses, vices, prejudices are the road to monarchy, right? So from his perspective, if he allows, as he sees it, the population to stray away from their revolutionary virtues, that's the road back to tyranny and monarchy. And here he talks a little bit about, this is sort of a response to those who were saying, I agreed with 1789, but aren't things getting a little bit out of hand? He says, we have more to fear from the excesses of weakness than from excesses of energy. The warmth of zeal is not perhaps the most dangerous rock that we have to avoid, but rather that languor which ease produces and a distrust of our own courage. And then he says, I need not say that I am not here justifying any excess, but that's exactly what he's doing. He says, that's not what I'm doing, but that's what he's doing, right? He's saying, this is how I justify the violent excesses of the revolution. Look, we should fear more falling back into weakness and vice than we should being a little too enthusiastic, which is how he describes the sort of mass killing of the terror. He ends here with a very explicit justification of the terror. He's not talking around the issue. He's saying exactly what he feels, right? So he says, if virtue be the spring of a popular government in times of peace, the spring of that government during a revolution is virtue combined with terror. Virtue without terror is destructive. Terror without virtue is impotent. Terror is only justice prompt, severe, and inflexible. It is then an emanation of virtue. It is less a distinct principle than a natural consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to the most pressing wants of the country. Right? So for Robespierre, terror is a necessary and good thing, right? Terror is justice, but prompt, severe, and inflexible. He says that you need to have them together. You can't have terror without virtue or virtue without terror. You need them both, but combined, they sort of make this revolution, this society that he envisions. And he sort of responds to those who talk about, well, Robespierre, terror, it's not necessarily a good thing, is it? He says, it has been said that terror is the spring of despotic government. Does yours then resemble despotism? Yes, as the steel that glistens in the hands of heroes of liberty resembles the sword with which the satellites of tyranny are armed. So does my terror resemble the terror of tyranny? Well, sure it does, but just the same as the sword of a hero resembles the sword of a villain, right? That's all it is. Let the despot govern by terror his debased subjects. He is right as a despot. Conquer by terror the enemies of liberty, and you will be right as the founders of the republic. The government in revolution is the despotism of liberty against tyranny. Is force only intended to protect crime? Is not the lightning of heaven made to blast vice exalted? He says, is violence and force only to be used by tyrants against us, or should we use it against them? Right? So once again, explicitly defending that terror. And he says, the protection of government is only due to peaceable citizens, and all citizens in the republic are Republicans. Right? He says royalists, conspirators, they're strangers or rather enemies. They are not citizens in our republic. We will defend the Republicans, right? Those who are ideologically aligned with me. Everyone else, they're an enemy. They're an internal enemy, and they must be purged, right? So this is Robespierre's explanation and justification for the terror, right? It sort of springs from his political ideology. He was extremely ideological, an ideologue, as I've said. Now, like I've said as well, near the end, I do think that ideology began to revolve more and more around him individually. He became more and more narcissistic. He really started to lose it. But it does spring from his sort of very strict political principles.
Radicals would be in almost total control of the government. And this brings us to the story of a woman named Charlotte Corday. Charlotte lived in the northwest city of Caen, and like many in the area, was horrified at the rapid radicalization and increasing violence of the revolution.
Yeah, Charlotte Corday was associated with the Girondin faction, right? So that, at this point, more moderate faction, at least compared to the Montagnard led by Robespierre.
And the man she blamed more than anyone was Jean-Paul Marat. She wanted to bring peace back to France, and so she did something drastic. She traveled to Paris and told Marat she had a list of enemies for him to publish in his paper. Marat eagerly invited her in for a meeting. So where's that list of enemies you promised me? Here it is. Wait a minute. This isn't a list of enemies. It just says, yippee-ki-yay, mother... And just like that, Marat was no more. Charlotte was quickly arrested.
And I'll point out,
and just like
that painting right here, The Death of Marat, by the very famous painter at that time, Jacques-Louis David, very famous neoclassical painter. He did a lot of work about scenes from ancient history, classical history, also did a lot of work during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods, right? So this is one of those most famous paintings of the Revolutionary era, and David, right, his work, really a good way to sort of look through this era of French history.
Like that, Marat was no more. Charlotte was quickly arrested and sent to the guillotine. Her dream of restoring peace, however, died with her.
Yeah.
Marat became a martyr. In temples of reason, symbols of the dead Marat became the new crucifix. In death, he became an even more powerful inspiration for the extreme levels of violence that were about to rip throughout the new republic.
I mean, he became a martyr, essentially. And during his life, he justifies this violence against the enemies of France. He is then murdered by what he would call an enemy of France. So what do you think that's going to do? Well, to a lot of people, that's going to further justify the violence and the terror.
That's right. Here comes the Reign of Terror. If you thought this revolution already sounds pretty violent...
I mean, here it comes. It's already been happening. We've already essentially been talking about the terror. The Vendée, that's one of the biggest examples of the Reign of Terror. So we've already sort of been in the Reign of Terror.
Well, you ain't seen nothing yet, son. The radicals were now in control.
And you can keep in mind Robespierre's justifications that we discussed as we go through this.
I believe not only was France surrounded by foreign enemies, but that within the masses, there were also plenty of internal ones too. Individuals not loyal to the revolution, conspiring to bring about its downfall. Robespierre and the rest of the radical faction were having none of it. A new committee of public safety was established with 12 members. Its purpose was to protect the new French Republic from its enemies, and it basically became a 12-man dictatorship with Robespierre as its leading voice. The Revolutionary Tribunal was also reinstated, a special court created to streamline the process of trying suspected enemies and handing out their death sentences. With these two new institutions, Robespierre wanted to scare France's enemies straight. In September 1793, it was announced that terror would be the order of the day. In other words, fear had become official government policy. And from then onwards, we enter into the period known as the Reign of Terror. Spies and secret police were everywhere and watched the people closely. France's public had to be extremely careful what they said and how they behaved. Obviously, criticizing this new system, or the government, would quickly have you sent off to the guillotine. But that's not all. Even the most minor offense could have you tried before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Hello, Citizen Martin. Hello, Monsieur Dubois. Monsieur? Did I just hear you say Monsieur? That's the old style of address, my friend. To the guillotine! You know what? I didn't like him, but I do...
Yeah, I mean, this is the era, and we've already talked quite a bit about the terror, so I won't go into it too much. But this is where, even being suspected of opposing the revolution could get you in a lot of trouble. And to be clear, this didn't always lead to execution. It's a bit of an an oversimplification. Look at the channel. A bit of an over-exaggeration, I should say. Some of these minor, what were seen as offenses, you would, if caught, still be locked up. Probably not executed, but there certainly were a lot of executions during this period.
Feel kind of bad for the king and his family. Oof, expressing sympathy for the royal family, are we? To the guillotine! 12 sous for a loaf of bread? That's way overpriced. To the guillotine! Man, this bread line is taking forever. To the guillotine! And you look like you're thinking anti-revolutionary thoughts. To the guillotine. Max, we're sending way too many people to the guillotine.
Max.
To the guillotine! Chop, 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 chop. It was insane. All across France, about 40,000 people were killed for suspected crimes against liberty. Let's say your neighbor won't stop mowing the lawn at 7 in the morning. Well, then all you gotta do is tell the government they've been talking smack about the revolution, and there's a good chance they'll end up in front of the Revolutionary Tribunal. Maybe they'll even be executed, taking a metaphorical load off your shoulders and a literal one off theirs. The most prominent victim of the Reign of Terror was a certain Marie Antoinette, who was finally tried and found guilty of...
Yeah, this one isn't too surprising, right? Louis had already been executed. Marie Antoinette, she was also a conservative royal. We also talked about, especially last time, how Marie Antoinette, to the people of France, was a real symbol of the excesses of the Ancien regime, right? The old regime, the aristocracy. Now, a lot of stories were made up about her, so people said a lot of things. A lot of them weren't true, but they saw her as a representative of the vice and excess and wasted wealth of the aristocracy of France. So once again, it's not too surprised that she ended up getting her head chopped off.
Treason in 1793. She expected she'd be brought to the guillotine in a royal carriage, fit for a queen. All the Republic could provide for her, however, was a wooden tumbril. At 37 years old, the most hated woman in French history met her end on the 16th of October, 1793. Robespierre had saved the revolution through terror. Internal dissent was being suppressed. The food situation was no longer quite as bad. Even the French military had got its act together again and pummeled the Allies at the Battle of Fleurus.
Yeah, and I mean, this is how Robespierre would justify, and the supporters would justify what they did. I mean, we read through his justifications, but more than that, that was sort of a philosophical justification. He would say, it worked. Right? We saw revolutionary France at its lowest lows in terms of survivability. It was being surrounded by its enemies. It was being attacked by internal enemies, right? Counter-revolutions throughout France. It looked like the revolutionary government may fall. The argument of Robespierre and those around him was that, and through the terror, we ended that, right? We kicked the army back in shape. We defeated our enemies. We defeated our internal insurrections through mass violence. We brought the French Revolution back to life. We managed to survive. Now, this is also where you get to the point where there were, some people in the government who did agree with that. But now that France was sort of in recovery, you had some people who started to say, well, fair enough, but shouldn't we stop the terror then? We're on better footing. We've defeated the internal insurrections, defeated our external enemies. Isn't it time we go back to the sort of less violent, regular order of affairs? Now, Robespierre did not like that.
For Danton and his followers, the time was right to try to normalize the French Republic.
Right.
Hey,
exactly. Danton and Desmoulins right there. Danton, he was a member of this faction with Robespierre. He was not a Girondin, but he had been friendly with some of those guys who had been executed. So Danton, right, he's a member, and Desmoulins, they are some of these most radical of the radicals, but they're not quite as radical as Robespierre, right? Like I said, the Overton window always shifts. And so they say, hey, you know what? We get it. We know why the terror was necessary, but let's bring it to an end.
Robespierre. So we were thinking that since things are finally going better, maybe we should rein in the terror. And while we're on it, we could possibly start taking it easier on the church, and also try to end this costly war. Oh, crap. As time went on, Robespierre seemed to go, for lack of a better term, a bit mental.
Yeah, I think he did. And I'll point out that speech we read from Robespierre in early 1794, it was both a justification of what he'd already done, but also a justification of the continue terror, right? You can sort of read into that, where Danton says, all right, we've defeated our enemies, let's bring the terror to an end, let's chill out a little bit. And Robespierre gives this speech where he's like, no, we need to continue the terror. We still have internal enemies. We need to create this republic of virtue that I have envisioned, right? And, now we'll see how Robespierre, like I said, and like Oversimplified just said, starts to lose it a little bit. A
He
lot.
was hell-bent on creating what he called a republic of virtue.
Right.
And for him, this meant amping up the bloodshed even more. Throughout the spring and summer of 1794, executions reached an unprecedented level during a period known as the Great Terror. Even those closest to him found their way to the guillotine if they dared oppose his ideas and actions, and he began alienating himself from the rest of the convention. He created a new deistic religion called the Cult of the Supreme Being.
Yeah, so we go from the Catholic Church to the Cult of Reason, which is all about, it's the Cult of Reason, right? So we put up on a pedestal reason and the ideas of the Enlightenment and civic virtue. And a lot of people didn't like that. Now take it a step further to where now we have a religion centered around Robespierre. You thought the Cult of Reason was bad. Well, now it's getting even worse.
Along with the new annual Festival of the Supreme Being. Man, I think Robespierre is really starting to lose it. He thinks he's a god or something. Nonsense. Sure, he's gone a little extreme, but he doesn't think he's a god. My children, bathe your immortal souls in the virtue of my republic. Okay, yeah, he's completely lost it.
Sometimes when you get to these really intense ideologues, you can find that their ideology essentially becomes a religion to them, right? They believe in it so fervently that it might as well be a sort of religious belief. That is the degree of their faith and their belief system. And with Robespierre, that was very literal. He actually sort of turns it into a religion. And that's how people knew, okay, he was really going off the deep end.
Robespierre's ultimate mistake, however, came on July 26th when he made a speech to the National Convention in which he said this: I have in my hand a brand new list of enemies to be sent to the guillotine. And many of you are on this list, but I'm not going to tell you who yet. What do you think of that? I think we should send Robespierre to the guillotine first.
Yeah.
All in favor? Oh, no.
They'd been seeing that the violence was getting closer and closer to home, right? All these guys are in Robespierre's faction, and they sort of support him, maybe genuinely, maybe not, as he does all this violence. They take out the Girondins. They say, oh, well, they may sort of be like us, but they're the moderates. They take out Danton and Desmoulins, and they start saying, hey, aren't they one of our guys? Well, I'm sure Robespierre had a good reason. And now he says, I'm going to kill all you, basically. Some of you. And they say, uh-oh, it's come to us. Get rid of Robespierre. Now's the time.
2 days later, Robespierre became the final victim of the monstrous terror and paranoia he had created. Many historical accounts of the revolution end here with the death of Robespierre and his terror. But the revolution officially continued for another 5 years until 1799.
Well, I don't know what officially means, but there are many, many debates about the French Revolution, but also specifically, when does the revolution end? What did the revolution mean? Those two questions are more intertwined than you might think, right? When does the revolution end? I don't know. Some people put it at the end of Robespierre. You have the Thermidorian reaction, right? A conservative reaction, the Directory. But yeah, that's still kind of revolutionary. Is it when Napoleon makes himself first consul? Well, I don't know. Is it when Napoleon makes himself emperor? And most people would probably say the revolution was done at that point. But even then, while Napoleon strays from some of his revolutionary principles, some of them he further cements, and he spreads some of these sort of French revolutionary values throughout Europe as he conquers. So even Napoleon has got an interesting relationship with the revolution. Now, I think, when Napoleon becomes emperor, the revolution's definitely over, but it's a more complicated question than you might think. Where does the revolution end? It turns out in history, things tend to not have such a clear end date, right? The influence of something like the French Revolution would continue in many different ways.
So what happened between now and then? Well, after the fall of Robespierre, a more moderate political group called the Thermidorians took control of the convention. They wanted to restore stability to the government. Now, Robespierre's allies and other radicals who had fueled the terror themselves became the target of political suppression. Bourgeois street fighters took on the radical
Yeah.
sans-culottes in the streets during a period named the White Terror.
Yeah, so we essentially get a counter-terror, right? A lot of violence done against the sans-culottes and these radical politicians, so stability, not really, because if you look at the next couple years of French history, we have this sort of, violent response, and then we've got a lot of coups to go through.
In 1795, the Thermidorians drafted a new constitution and created a government called the Directory, with the purpose of preventing power from being able to fall into the hands of a single individual again. As this new government was being established, royalists who wanted to bring the monarchy back to France saw this moment as an opportunity to strike. They staged an insurrection in Paris and battled with the National Guard in the streets. Luckily, one Napoleon Bonaparte happened to be in Paris at the time, and he took control of the situation, firing on the crowd and putting down the insurrection. From this moment on, the people of Paris would never again be able to stage a popular uprising and lost their control over the revolution.
Very big moment for Napoleon, right? This makes him a lot of friends among the government, among the Directory. They say, hey, that guy just saved our damn government, right? That helps him move through the ranks. If you remember, sure, Napoleon has this achievement at Toulon, but as his career begins, he's essentially sort of a political appointee. When he first gets installed with the army of Italy, like right at the beginning, some of the guys are saying, who is this guy? Oh, just selected by the politicians. He probably doesn't know what he's doing. Now, Napoleon proved them all very wrong, but he sort of gets his start by making political connections.
For his actions, Napoleon became a general and was sent to take control of the French armies in Italy. The new Directory remained a fairly ineffective government for the remainder of the revolution.
Yeah.
It was plagued with corruption and struggled to keep the economy afloat, and as a result, wasn't very popular.
Yeah, very corrupt. I've said this talking about the Directory before, but you've made it this far into the French Revolution. The defining character traits of politicians who made it this far was usually, self-preservation. These were people who mainly thought about protecting themselves, their own well-being, their own wealth, right? This was a very corrupt, sort of cynical group of individuals who ran this government. There were a lot of attempted coups. There was even one sort of proto-socialist coup, the 1796 Conspiracy of Equals, largely pushed by Gracchus Babeuf, who was sort of seen as a proto-socialist type guy. Right, so a lot of weird stuff going on in this era, but we largely had this government of very cynical politicians, which, unsurprisingly, is not super popular among the people. And the people, for their political heroes, begin to turn to one Napoleon Bonaparte as he starts winning more victories in the field, especially in Italy. He seems, more than the government, like the true defender of the French Republic.
For the people of France, with the strict social customs of both royalist France and the terror gone, they didn't really know what to do with themselves. Men no longer removed their hats when talking to women. Different classes began intermingling, and a publication began circulating that looked a lot like a modern dating app. It was social anarchy. Outside of France, the war continued. In 1795, France took the Netherlands, where they set up a puppet state. Then they negotiated both Prussia and Spain out of the war. The British attempted to land French royalists in the west to reinforce rebellion, but that plan failed. In 1796, the French planned a
the Brits' chance, their best chance, was really in 1793 with Toulon, right? To bolster the internal counter-revolutions that were already happening. At this point, France had already stabilized quite significantly.
Pronged attack with the aim of marching on Vienna and knocking Austria out of the war. The two northern armies were defeated and forced to retreat. However, Napoleon in the south, with groundbreaking military strategy, won battle after battle after battle. He pushed the Austrians out of Italy and began closing in on Vienna. The Austrians freaked out, and Napoleon oversaw the signing of a peace treaty. He had almost single-handedly knocked Austria out of the war, and by the way, he was only 28. So maybe it's about time you moved out of your mom's basement. Napoleon became a famed hero among the French people, but his aspirations...
Right, and Napoleon, this was of course a great achievement, which would have made a name for anybody. But remember, Napoleon, he's a smart guy. He's got an eye towards his career, right? And so he makes sure to propagandize a lot, right? All of his achievements. He's got people to paint him. He's writing reports back, sending them to the public in France. He makes sure to well publicize every single one of his achievements. And even some that aren't achievements, he makes them seem like they are, right? So Napoleon's incredible achievements, combined with the fact that he's constantly propagandizing, makes him very, very popular.
Out of your mom's basement. Napoleon became a famed hero among the French people, but his aspirations were still higher. He briefly went off to Egypt and discovered a bunch of gnarly Egyptian stuff, but then the British destroyed his fleet and trapped his forces. Say, Napoleon, sir, you're not going to leave us here stuck in Egypt and return to France, are you? Nonsense, my boy. I would never dream of abandoning my loyal soldiers. Wow, what's that over there? On his return to Paris, Napoleon found himself to be extremely popular, and the government extremely unpopular, and he started getting some power-hungry ideas. Conveniently, a politician named Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès approached Napoleon and said, "Hey man, since you're so popular, do you want to help me stage a coup?" "Great idea. Let's stage a coup, and then I'll coup you." What?
Yeah, so, and by the way, I've done videos on most of these parts of Napoleonic history. You can check out the playlist. I'll link it down below on Epic Histories Napoleon videos. But Napoleon, after his great military exploits, come back, and the Abbé Sieyès, who we talked about last time, who wrote that very famous piece, What is the Third Estate? He was sort of prominent early in the revolution, and with the sort of conservative reaction following the end of Robespierre and the Reign of Terror, some of those early guys managed to return. Right, Sieyès, who had sort of been outmoded by the radicals, someone like him manages to come back. He's more a sort of, in the context of the revolution, a sort of moderate liberal type. In different contexts, he still might be a bit of a radical, but compared to some of the others, he is more of a sort of status quo liberal type individual. Now, he sees what everyone else sees, that the Directory is extremely corrupt and unpopular, and he says, you know what? Let's overthrow it. Let's, classic French type stuff. Now, he's got a crew, but what he needs is essentially some muscle, right? Someone who can enforce his coup if necessary. And so, he brings in Napoleon. Now, Napoleon's own brother actually warns Sieyès, hey, Napoleon's going to take over this coup if you bring him in. But Sieyès feels like he doesn't have any other options. He has to bring in Napoleon. And what happens? Well, Napoleon basically takes over the coup. Right, he makes it into his coup. He kind of runs the whole thing. It's not the smoothest coup of all time. It's a little bumpy, but relatively easily, Napoleon takes over power, and he continues to take over power. First as first consul of the government, which he's already essentially running, and then as emperor. Right, so this is Napoleon's true rise to power, facilitated by the Abbé Sieyès right here. Though he didn't necessarily intend it, he probably should have seen it coming.
What? Napoleon, with the help of his politician brother, entered the government chamber, possibly got punched in the face, and finally his troops intimidated the council to dissolve the government and create a new constitution that basically made Napoleon a dictator. So there you have it. The French Revolution, born with the great promise of liberty and equality. The common people dared challenge an oppressive system that had existed for centuries. But before they knew it, they found liberty sidelined by terror, equality that possibly didn't quite hit the mark, and an absolute monarchy replaced by an absolute dictator. Napoleon began stabilizing French society. He restored the Catholic Church and got rid of that crazy calendar, among other things. But he remained ever ambitious. He was France's first consul, but
Yeah, Napoleon, like I said, he had a complex relationship with the revolution, right? He turns back some of the parts of the revolution, but he does keep a lot. Napoleon, in his early career, was very much as a representative of that French revolutionary spirit. Many people feel that he betrays the revolution, which I think is a fair sort of understanding of events. But in some ways, he spreads those revolutionary ideals even further throughout Europe. So, it's a complicated thing with Napoleon.
Slept soundly at night dreaming of being something even bigger. Napoleon's expansionist aspirations, combined with the ongoing conflict in Europe, would eventually lead the continent into a huge conflict known today as...
Yeah. Alrighty. How about that ending? And maybe we'll do that next. Maybe we'll do the Napoleonic Wars next, though. I really have covered the Napoleonic Wars a lot on my channel. The French Revolution, I mean, there's always a lot to say about it. I've yapped a lot. I could yap some more. There have been debates over the interpretation of the French Revolution from during the Revolution until today, right? That first big debate between Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine. Burke, who from a sort of conservative traditionalist position argued against the revolution, its overturning of norms and traditions, and Thomas Paine, the famous liberal who argued in favor of the French Revolution and the right of revolution and all those types of things. That initial debate up until more modern debates, you've got your Georges Lefebvre Marxist interpretation, then Francois Furet sort of steps a little bit away from that. You've got your sort of Keith Baker linguist, postmodern type interpretation, your Albert Sobol Marxist interpretation. I mean, the French Revolution is one of the most debated topics of history, I think. There's been endless discussion about what really happened. What was the meaning of the revolution? What does it mean? Of course, the French Revolution was endlessly influential for everything to come afterwards. I mean, the influence is truly incredible. It really reshaped Europe and the world, and basically every revolution to follow the French Revolution was in some way inspired by it. Even until today, when the Russian Revolution happens, which also those guys took notes from the French Revolution. Since then, the Russian Revolution has been more the one that people have been taking notes from. But even still, the French Revolution, just incredibly influential. So yeah, a lot to be said. I have said a little bit of it, right? There's an incredible amount to read if you're interested. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, become a channel member, right? Hit that join button next to the subscribe button to get videos like this early. Let me know down below which oversimplified videos you'd like me to react to. He's got a whole back catalog that I haven't gone through yet, so I'd be interested to hear. With that, hope you guys are having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.